So we're going to have this panel now that involves some really amazing individuals, which includes Kevin as well. And that panel is going to be looking at a couple of key issues regarding the state of emergence. This is artists influencing equitable and diverse cultural policy and funding models for sustainably diverse art sector. We're doing this in partnership with Mass Culture as part of sort of opening up this conversation around those subjects. And we have an incredible lineup of speakers. Cynthia Licker-Sage, who I'm sure is known by everyone, the Executive Director of the Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance, and a wonderful individual and person to always share with and talk with and learn from. Shannon Litzenberger, most of you probably know her as an activist in the field. She had worked with the Canadian Arts Summit, the Canadian Dance Assembly, and is now working with CPAMO as a program associate. And we're really honored to have her work with us for the work she does around embodiment practices and her sensitivities around the topics we're talking about, the knowledge she brings. Renata Suter of Propeller Dance, an amazing company that is bringing forward the engaged dance from persons with physical abilities and those who are challenged in that way, and what this conversation might mean in that regard. And certainly last but not least, Kevin Ormsby, who is the program manager for CPAMO, as you know, also the artistic director of Kasha Dance. So let's start with, I think we're starting with Cynthia first, and then we'll go in that order I just read: Cynthia, Shannon, Renata, and then Kevin. Yes. Shannon, you're moderating.
Yes, it's okay. I do know that I'm moderating. So thank you. Thank you so much, Charles. And thank you for making that wonderful introduction. I am honored to be on this panel amongst a wonderful group of humans who bring such insight to this topic. So yes, thank you to CPAMO, and thank you to Mass Culture and the Art of Festivals for inviting this conversation. This, as I understand it, will be one of a series of conversations that's really trying to network our thinking and network our knowledge together as we start thinking about systems change and how artists can be participating in that conversation from their lived experiences. So to get us started in a good way, and because we have a bit of a luxurious amount of time for this conversation, I wanted to offer a bit of context to begin, in the hopes that this will provide a nice platform for our speakers to move us toward vision. So, because I'm an embodiment practitioner, I'd like to, as I'm offering some of these reflections, I'd like to invite you, if you so wish, to disengage from the screen for a moment and just allow yourself to enter into an introspective kind of position, if you wish. And, I'm hoping that some of what I will say will be, a helpful framing. It might be provocative. It might be, there might be things that you resonate with, and there might be things that you feel tension or resistance around. And so my invitation to you is to tune into your body for this moment of context setting, and to perhaps notice when those moments arise, because I think those moments are the moments that are going to enrich our conversation a bit later. And the hope is that we will come to a point where all of us can be engaging in conversation around this together with the panelists. So, okay, let's just take a deep breath. It's an understatement to say that the pandemic has been devastating for many of us, but it needs to be said, the pandemic has been devastating for artists. It's been devastating for our field, and we're still in it. The story of the pandemic continues to unfold. We continue to experience this collective state of disruption, of loss and grief, of reflection, and perhaps on a more positive note, of hope for a different future. The moment we are in right now is simultaneously an emergency and a revolution. In an emergency, our impulse is to stabilize, to mitigate damage, to prioritize survival. And in a revolution, our impulse is to mobilize, to disrupt, and to set fire to the establishment, to make way for the rising phoenix. So I would propose that perhaps governments and funders are working on the former, while artists are working on the latter. And so we find ourselves in a moment of paradox, where the system is trying to preserve itself while artists are mounting a resistance. In the early stages of the pandemic, the federal government's emergency relief funds first supported institutions, core funded organizations, and to a lesser extent, other recently funded project-based entities, offering very little in the way of support for artists directly outside of universal measures like CERB. And it was only much later, in a much later phase, where industry-specific recovery efforts were aimed at artists. And this latter phase of support for artists, of the $181.5 million in federal money that was messaged as support for artists, of that, less than half was directed to programs available to individual artists. The results of such programs remain unknown for the most part, and resources 14 months into the pandemic remain somewhat undeployed. The devil is in the details. For me, this reinforced that the art sector is not an ecosystem where activity flows from the artist at the center, but a pyramid where the trickle-down effect of resources never quite makes it all the way to the bottom. And in case you weren't sure, in this metaphor, the artist is at the bottom. As the challenging politics of resource distribution unfolds, there's another conversation emerging in society about the importance of artists at this moment. Artists are not just here to entertain and comfort us, as popular media might suggest. Artists have, I would argue, a much, much more fundamental role, and that is one of world making. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here when I say that the process of art making is a process of world making. It's a process that centers imagination and the creation of meaning, and it has the ability to disrupt old interpretations of a shared reality by telling new stories, offering up new metaphors, and resituating familiar ideas in new contexts. Art also has the potential to imagine futures that don't yet exist, priming the public imagination with an expanded set of possibilities for our shared existence. When we make art, this is what we are doing. So the processes inherent in art making are essential right now, because we're in a moment where an old world is collapsing and a new world has yet to emerge. The cycles of history tell us that artists have always been at the forefront in moments of social transformation. And because artists are meaning makers and stewards of the public imagination, it is essential that Canada's system of cultural production supports a diverse and representative expression of the sociocultural context we all share. This is the foundation of a democratic society in a context of growing cultural plurality. The privileging of certain types of cultural expression over others is a form of social control, exercised through institutionalization, the disproportionate distribution of funding, and the creation of cultural policies that don't encompass or consider the contexts or processes of a wide range of cultural expressions. However, diverse cultural identities simply represented within a white supremacist system risk being exotified, tokenized, and co-opted to further the aims of the Western colonial project. And to avoid such an outcome, IBPOC artists have to simultaneously seek greater engagement while also participating in the reimagining of the rules and dynamics governing the system of cultural production itself. Put more plainly, representation within the system as it was designed risks producing the same old outcomes. And if you were here earlier, I just want to offer an amplification of Dean Dory Tenstall of OCAD-U, who just said it way better than I did. And she used a dance metaphor too, which just makes me like her even more. And she said, and I'm just going to paraphrase, that diversity is merely being invited to the party. Inclusion is being invited to dance. But to dance the dances that the host knows, maybe the waltz, maybe the foxtrot, when really she wanted to dance the salsa. And I love this. I love this story because I think this is a wonderful metaphor for what we're talking about here. This institutionalized colonial design in the arts is a familiar one. And we see this replicated and amplified throughout the entire neoliberal capitalist system that the West has built. And I'm really heartened by the ways so many of our speakers and panelists have already been talking about this very foundation that we're trying to disrupt. These systems continue to produce egregious harms that have only been further exaggerated by the pandemic. Climate injustice, social injustice, wealth inequality. We are embedded in a classist, ableist, racist, misogynist system held in place by hierarchies of power and control. The pandemic has revealed to us how deeply interconnected we are to each other and to our environment and to these systems that we are embedded in. And so if it is all of us, regardless of where we come from, what we believe in, or who we are, if we are living here in Canada, we are embedded in and subjected to a system that is deeply informed by a Western worldview with cultural roots in British and French traditions. This worldview is focused on objective, rational ways of knowing, ignoring the subjective, relational, and experiential ways we create meaning within a shared reality. It's a world focused on progress and growth at the expense of human and planetary health. It's a world that still believes unfettered capitalism will create prosperity and improve quality of life despite the ways in which the gap between the rich and the poor is widening. It's a world that understands power as finite, is prone to binary thinking, celebrates the individual, and externalizes human value. It's a world built for a default human, creating a hierarchy in the value of human life in our society. That's pretty grim, I know. But the good news is that if it's true that governments are trying to stabilize while artists are trying to mobilize, then we have already started this work of world making. Our challenge will be to do this collectively and in solidarity when it comes to transforming this system of cultural production we are all embedded in. While we might agree on the ways the system is broken, creating harm and producing all the same outcomes it was designed for, despite good intentions and incremental change over the years. However, if we want to do the work of transformation, we need to not only challenge these underlying concepts and principles the old world was built on, but work together to present a new vision for a system in a world that doesn't yet exist. When we challenge concepts like objectivity and objective truth, we problematize the idea of standards, standardization, including notions of artistic excellence. When we want to engage with ways of knowing beyond the limits of rational thinking, we problematize concepts of explicit value, public impact, and evaluation of artistic product. When we start imagining a sustainable world, we problematize concepts of progress, innovation, and growth. And when we talk about diversity as an essential condition of a healthy ecosystem, well, we problematize power dynamics, leadership, and the status of the artist. Our work is not unprecedented. Throughout all of human history, there are examples of countercultures, organized resistance, and mobilization in times of crisis. And today, I would suggest we as artists and arts workers, all of us that are here in this Zoom room right now, we are working from a place of greater agency because the world needs us right now. And so we might have the opportunity to set our terms. And these terms are about the distribution of resources and the policies that govern these resources. These terms are also about the culture and the social dynamics that we navigate as participants in this system. We have the ear of governments and funders right now who are actively deploying resources with a consciousness that the world of tomorrow needs to be different from the world of today. So then, what are the features, organizing principles, and values of this sustainable, diverse ecosystem that equitably supports artists? What are the new terms? And what is this new vision? So here, I'm going to turn this question over to our panelists. And I've asked in advance that they all sort of begin with the articulation or expression of a vision, and that this could also be symbolic. So I've invited them all to, if they wanted to bring an object or an image through which to express some of the metaphorical ways that we think about vision. Visions aren't always explicit and totally clear, but they do provide a compass and a direction forward. So with that, I'd like to invite Cynthia Liquor-Sage to begin. Over to you, Cynthia.
Sego everyone, Cynthia Liquor-Sage, Mohawk Nation, Turtle Clan from 6 Nations of the Grand River. And Yamagoa for that wonderful introduction and provocation, Shannon, that was fantastic. Hi everyone. This one actually took me a little while to think about, but I was thinking that I'm going to share this one. This is our medallions that our team from the Tuckerana Music Festival, this is our lanyard when we go to meetings and everything. And it's something that we created. Well, our festival is starting on Friday, but we started last year during the pandemic. And it was really interesting because it was our way of coping with the fact that our performing arts industry was imploding at the time, that we were in triage mode, trying to find ways to, I guess, expand or sustain the current performing arts infrastructure that we had all spent all this time and energy creating, and then just to watch it implode was just heart-wrenching, as we all know. Here we are today. We started a festival last year where we brought in Indigenous performers from around the world, just kind of had a celebration, and we're hoping to get maybe about 10,000 views. That was our goal. And we were like thinking, it's a lofty view. We got that the first night. So it's been one thing where ever since then, every month since our festival, we've been working with different events and different festivals, both nationally and internationally. We worked with the Edinburgh Fringe, for instance, to present some events and stuff like that. This particular, I guess, the reason I wanted to share this one is it was our way of saying that we're going to reset this the way that we want to do this. We are going to set with our own benchmarks of how we envision our own benchmarks. Our ways of celebrating success are different than, I guess, mainstream would want to say, or European settler ally, wherever you want to, whichever, I guess, term that people gravitate to who aren't within the BIPOC community or don't feel themselves within the BIPOC community. This was what we were focusing on. And it's been incredible to see the ground surge of people coming together to kind of see like, okay, how do we want this to move forward? And it's kind of led to different conversations, both nationally and internationally, because of this one little, I guess, spark. And again, it just started as something small that we were originally going to do in person, took all the funding, shifted it on to the online, and even we were able to, I guess, match all the artist fees that anybody had proposed to us before the pandemic, which I guess at the time was unheard of. So it's like $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000, $12,000, whatever you're asking, we would pay it for your online performance. We brought in technical teams that work on TV broadcasting to help the artists and stuff like that. So we were making our own stuff and our own content, putting it out there. And it's kind of made our own framework on how we move forward. And it's changed the dialogue on how we interact with presenters, which has been really interesting because they're coming to us about, okay, so your success measures are different than, and I was like, yes, they are. Historically, when we could meet in person, Indigenous peoples, we would like to go onto the land and do proper protocol, introduce ourselves, ask for permission to come onto the land. There was all these things, and then all of a sudden that stopped because, again, this is our new paradigm, is to be sitting in these little boxes talking to each other. So there's certain things that we were starting to do. So basically, we developed things like kits, so protocol kits. So we'd mail them out to elders, which included our smudge and some tokens that we would normally do in person. We used Canada Post and sent them out. So we were trying to develop our own ways of kind of some familiarity within these timeframes. But I don't want to take up too much time. I just wanted to share that little tidbit, and I'll pass it back to you. Yeah, I'll go on.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm definitely going to come back to you a bit later about those measures of success. But first, I'd like to invite Renata to share some thoughts about your vision for the future.
Great. Thank you, Shannon. And thank you, Kevin and Charles, Cynthia, for sharing this space together. It's a real honor to be here today. I'll just start off with a quick introduction. This is what we always do at Propeller Dance, is for people who are visually impaired or have blindness. We just give a visual introduction of ourselves. So I am a middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, wearing pink glasses and a yellow top in front of a bookcase. And I'm sitting in my basement in Ottawa, which is on the unceded Algonquin Nation land. So here we are. Vision is such a big word. And I want to kind of bring some practicalities into vision and some non-practicalities, but I also am a little amiss because I always will co-present with a member of our Propeller Dance company, and that wasn't possible today. So I wanted to know, Kevin, if you could screen share, or someone behind the scenes could screen share that cover of Propeller Dance's annual report. Okay, can everybody see that? All right, so this is my introduction to our vision of Propeller Dance. We're an inclusive, integrated, contemporary dance company. And this image is of our company dancer, Robert Chartier. Robert's from the Wendake Nation. And what I love about this image is the vision that Rob gives of a very non-normative valuing of our artistic and life expression. So he's wearing a t-shirt of an image of Spasticus, of Ian Drury, who created the disability rights anthem called Spasticus Autisticus, which was a very wonderful mobilizing anthem for the disability rights movement of the 60s, 70s in the UK. And artistic associate at Propeller Dance, Liz Winkler, who is an artist with a disability and a member of our leadership team, created a piece called Spasticus. And I think this image of Rob really kind of epitomizes our vision of energy and a channeling for positive change of anger and a real sense of all of that. So there was another image I will just quickly show. I'm sorry, it's not super clear, but is of this image of a piece that I choreographed in collaboration with our company called Flesh and Spokes. And again, I feel like this image of that piece, the photo is by Omar Yusakar, And the dancers are Sylvain Bouchard, Jeff Dollar, Russell Winkler, Amelia Griffin, Liz Winkler, and C. Ancheta. Again, there's our sense of interdependence and connectedness that I really think is such an important part of our vision for the future. Propeller Dance is a company that includes people of all abilities and multiple diversities, people with mental health challenges and lived experience of mental health and neurodiversity, like myself, and people with cognitive disability, people on the autism spectrum. We have a no questions asked. You come as you are who you are, and we celebrate you. So it is what that is. And that vision, so I'll just stop sharing our annual report pictures, but I have lots more if anyone wants to see any more images of the company. Our vision is really about a deep listening and a caring and a respecting the choices and for language, for action, for activism that the artists with disabilities choose to come with or not come with as they choose. And we really have a very broad definition of culture too, which I think is really exciting because I feel like that's a shared space. And that we think of culture as our artistic expression, but also our life expression. So that it's not necessarily always about what ends up on a stage in that Eurocentric black box perspective, but it might also be the process of how we got there, or the works that didn't get there and why, and maybe the fact that we chose to take our work outside and explore a natural space that was not accessible to a dancer that uses a wheelchair, that was actually the product that was of value to that artwork. So I think our vision has a lot to do with expanding that notion of what is considered valuing of culture and artistic practice. And the vision also has to do with really valuing your previous presentation. She used the word family to speak about her group of young women, and that sense of relationship being important, so that we're actually caring about each other and caring about how we work together as a group. And that is a part of our culture at Propeller Dance, and being there to support people in whatever ways they might need that support. And that's also our vision. And I'll just have two more quick things about vision, but it's a really complex field. And my quote that I often will say is, don't collapse the complexity. Don't collapse the complexity. So that we rather embrace the complexity within my specific field of disability arts, integrated dance. There's such a wide spectrum there. It's a very long, complex area. And I won't get into that now, but happy to do so if anyone cares to get into that in more detail. But that we embrace that complexity and value it and get excited about it, because to me, that's where a lot of the creativity can happen and grow as well, is in that process. And of course, you know, the pandemic, like Shannon had said, it's been brutal. And we need also that time to heal from this time. And we can't necessarily go from zero living in our basements back to, you know, intense output of creative expressions. It's going to be a process of healing, and we need time to rebuild as well. So I think that's about it. I'll just end with also the vision of a lot of what we've grown and learned this year has really been about embedding accessibility through all that we do, even more than we previously did. And we still have loads of work to do, but is really embedding accessibility through our digital platforms, as well as through all of our in-person programming as well, so that all can participate who choose to do so. So thanks. I'll turn it back to you, Shannon.
Thank you so much, Renata. I love the process over product. I think about this a lot. I love it. And I feel like artists think about this a lot too, how much value is inside those processes and how our values are expressed in how we engage in artistic creation processes. And of course, I also love your way of thinking about not collapsing complexity. I think that's brilliant and something for us to keep in mind, because, you know, complexity can be one of those sort of ambiguous terms, but within it, it's this, I think it is a bit of like the foggy mess that we're constantly moving in. And for sure, the Western worldview likes to have answers and classifications and and boxes for things. And I think maybe the invitation to complexity is to, you know, lean into the questions and see where we can explore inside questions, which is also part of that creative process that artists are engaged in on the regular. So thank you so much for that. And now I will turn it over to Kevin, who has agreed to join this wonderful group. And, you know, Kevin says he's the man behind the scenes, but I think there's great benefit for us when he's the man in front for this moment with all of us together. So Kevin, over to you.
Wow. Thank you, Shannon. I like being behind the scenes, at least I think I do. Often being relegated and calling that as a privilege to being in front and having the language and the understanding to do so. So I think that's taking from what Cynthia was talking about, changing the dialogue. I think that's part of what needs to happen in the sector right now, but also, which is beautiful for Renata to talk about, not collapsing the complexity. I'd like to add understanding the complexity. And so the thing I brought and want to share is this idea of what do you see? For me, I love plants. From afar, you might start to say it's an orchid, and you might start to see leaves. You may see it's in a double pot, but another part. What are you not seeing in this relationship as I now zero in closer and understand the complexities? We see that it has striations, it has a lip, it has many things. And there are things that we're not seeing, I think, in the arts ecology that I want to allude to, this idea of a plant. What are the roots? What are the root structure that supports the orchid, the beauty that we see, and we can call it performance. So I brought this in because for me, nature informs a lot about how I think about what the vision of the future can be. I have an unfair advantage, and I'll just put that in the chat, which is that I was invited by CBC to write an article around what can dance think about for envisioning the future? And I want to just read a part of it as my sort of visioning, and I'll just take out dance and I'll just put in the arts. Arts in a contemporary Canadian society should not be relegated to the studio and performance venues with superficial audience and contemporary engagement. We need to stop alienating community arts from concert and commercial spaces and practitioners. A desirable vision for me for moving beyond 2021 would be to depart more often from the traditional spaces, theaters, venues, studios, etc., and meet people where they are. Then for me, we start to understand the complexities. Then in those spaces, we can create and shape together and enhance the iterations of what the arts can be in a post-COVID reality. But it requires understanding the biodiversity of the sector. It involves understanding the ethnocultural relationships that exist in the center, that is actually building the sector, that has actually been supporting the sector. You know, a couple of years ago, I was invited. So that's my vision for me. I think it's also moving to the fact that art is political. The act of funding, the act of receiving and not receiving funding is a political statement. It's a political act. So when organizations fall in silence or artists fall in silence, I'm often cautious of this idea that in moving forward, the advocacy, the knowledge about how that impacts our well-being as a person and then as an artist needs to be understood. So what for me, like the orchid, is involved in the fertilizing of a different ecology, a different arts ecology, where we're channeling art as a political movement aligned to creation. For me, part of that vision is For Canada as a country to understand that when it says things like cultural policy and the arts ecology, that it's looking at it from a Western Eurocentric lens. And that I'll go between using myself as a creator and also as a program manager. As a creator and a supporter of those that I work with in an organization, Cachet Dance, I have to be mindful of that, because what are the cross-cultural relationships that arrive in that particular understanding? When we put culture into the world stage, whom is being lauded as Canadian artists? What is understood in this particular capacity? So for me, the future and what I hope for is really an unpacking of how funding and the arts ecology, though inviting, as Dory mentioned this morning, this idea of super tokenism, some of us to be amplified in space, how are we actually understanding what exactly exists in the Canadian cultural arts ecology? And how is a Canadian policy reflecting that? And so if I put my CPAMO hat on, I'm curious about this partnership in those particular ways, because for me, it's an interest over the sessions we'll have in June and also in September to really start to gather information from the field. And the field is the artists, meeting them where they are and hearing what they are saying, and how that can be a sort of iterative process in thinking about what the vision for the arts ecology in the future will be.
Thanks, Kevin. That's great. I mean, I want to acknowledge too that, you know, we're not at the beginning of this work. That, you know, there are lots of examples out there in the world of work that is trying to redefine a set of values and to work as a counterculture to some of the very oppressive and challenging ways that the Western world has imposed on all of us who live inside of it. And so I think this is where I want to take us next for a bit, is to ask the question around, you know, where are we seeing other organizations, Cynthia, that, you know, are defining new measures of success? And where, Renata, are we finding, you know, initiatives and artists that are working well in this state of complexity that values well-being? You know, and where, Kevin, to you, are we seeing organizations that are meeting artists where they are? So just invite you to think about that for a second, and maybe I'll go back to Cynthia first, if you don't mind, and just see if there's some things that are coming forward. And for those of you in the audience, I am open to also hearing some of what you might want to add into the chat. So, and if you're someone who needs to not look at the chat while we talk, feel free to just turn it off so that it doesn't bother you. But because we're trying to accumulate knowledge collectively today, you know, the things that are coming up for you out there are important too. And I just want to invite you to share some thoughts if you feel compelled in the chat with us. And I will do my best to just make some reference to other things that are coming out there. So, Cynthia.
Yeah, I can speak from what I'm seeing on the Indigenous landscape here in Canada in the performing arts sector, where we're basically seeing is it's kind of, the pandemic has been a reset. So we find like I've been hearing a lot of discussion about we've done 360, we've went and did that whole paradigm shift back to what was our traditional ways. Right now, what we're doing is almost like an oral teachings, an oral discussion and everything, where we're very focused. We're not being distracted by, okay, like conferences and festivals and, oh my God, okay, here's this chat over here. Okay, I'll talk to you a few minutes and everything. No, we're very focused right now. So this is traditionally, like in even the way that we're talking right now, you're having this discussion as a talking stick. So you're like, okay, so we're going around in the circle format and everything. So this is where it's kind of been really interesting to see where people are saying, how are you adjusting? And a lot of myself, including colleagues, we're doing okay, because it's kind of like we've been forced to go back to our blood memory, a way of interacting. So it's been kind of really interesting. And again, it's this moment of time where we're having access to a brain trust like never before. Because when's the last time we've had access to elders in our community, like senior performing artists and stuff like that, and having these discussions, these very visceral conversations where we would only get like scratching the surface at an events and stuff like that in the past, like 2 years ago. So that's that whole, I guess, the shift. And yeah, again, it's happening all across Canada. And I was lovingly saying when we had our chat earlier that it's kind of like, what is it, leaving the pedantic behind in the pandemic. So we're not having these little nitpicky conversations about blah, 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 blah. We're having these overarching, really empathetic conversations too, which has been really, I feel like, interestingly enough, as we're focusing on these, moving the dialogue forward and taking this opportunity to redefine how we see that dialogue happening, having these new forms of discussions and everything, having these opportunities for, and I say this all the time, for the people who are introverts, having their opportunity to shine too, because we're going into their community and their voices are being heard. And like even several performers said, like they're reaching out to audiences like they couldn't before because they weren't able to have that kind of interaction with audiences. But now this is an open playing field. So we're introducing a new form of performing arts too. So again, having all these different new things happening during this time of standing still has been really interesting.
That's great. I'm really glad to hear that, actually, that all of these conversations are really feeling robust and in that empathetic, deep listening kind of place. And it sounds like there's, you know, a profound moment of reconnecting to a lot of ancestral knowledge. So yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Renata, I'd love to ask you just this question of complexity. So do you have some thoughts about where you're maybe seeing this happening well out there in the field?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic, to think about it positively, has been around the connection that's been happening and the opportunity to be connecting more broadly than we were always so busy, you know, doing our thing, isolated in the studio. And now we're actually able to make time to connect with peers across the country and internationally, and start to have more peer-to-peer exchange, which for the field of integrated dance and disability arts, the isolation factor is a big one. and so that chance to exchange among peers is being incredibly valuable. There are also so many artists with disabilities in leadership roles now, and there's way more work to be done within Propeller Dance in that field area and within the field in general. But there are amazing artists. I think of Cyborg Circus in Toronto and David Bobier and others, many, Janelle Roos. I mean, there's so many. And so that continues to need to be held up and nurtured and grown with adequate income for artists with disabilities tend to be at the very bottom of income levels for artists. So that needs to be addressed in a more full way. But of course, now we also have the funding at all three levels of government. And along with that funding, there's also access support funding, which is a necessity. You can't do the work without it. And so there is that acknowledgement and that need and that support happening. And I guess when we started the work, myself and Shara Weaver and Alan Shane back almost 20 years ago, we were not the first ones in Canada, right? There's lots of people before us that did this work. The amazing France Geoffroy, who recently just sadly passed away, was such a pioneer in Canada for dance and disability. Sorry, I lost my train of thought thinking of France. But yeah, it's gone. There you go. There's my mental capacity diminished out in the open. C'est la vie. But maybe I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Shannon.
That's okay, Renata. You are not alone in that diminished mental capacity. I don't know. I feel like maybe there is like a paper to be written about the disembodying effects of being on Zoom for hours and hours and hours a day. But thanks. If if that comes back to you, I'll come back to you to offer it up.
I mean, in terms of well-being, that's a really interesting one with Zoom, because we limit our Zooms to like a maximum 1 hour at a time, just for that very Zoom fatigue reason. Most of us can't handle being on Zoom for more than an hour at a time. So, those, again, practicalities can be really important.
Yes, agreed. We'll see where we're at in after an hour passes. Maybe we'll have a little dance break. See how it goes. Okay. All right, Kevin, over.
Yeah, I just want to honor and I just want to send some love and hugs to Renata. I think more than anything else, where I see examples is in artists like who are on this call. We are here right now for a particular reason. I want to honor what Cynthia has also mentioned, that it's about going back to communities and actually amplifying voices. And I think that work has also been happening. So for me, I think I'm curious about the ways in which artists are working right now that never worked in before, and what are those ways, what are those practices? We see it online, we see it on Instagram. Someone who inspired me and has been a part of my work with Cashier Dance in one of our conversation is Mike Tyus, who used to dance with Cirque du Soleil and with Jonas Jacob, a company, but he created an amazing platform on Instagram for short videos. Sometimes I look at these and I go, oh my God, how does he do it? I just have questions, right? I'm like, how? But I want to just also honor that I think the work was already being done. And so I want to just bring those people into the space. I think the way NIA Center, not because I've just got off the board, has been working within community, but also providing mentorship and support for Black creatives. Is what its work has been, it's going on. Jumblies, who for years have done this work with intersecting with people and communities. And I don't think the lassos, this is the local art service organizations, I don't think they get enough props in the ecology, because the ecology is also saying that community arts is not valued in the same way as professional arts practices. So that dichotomy, I think, needs to also break. Because I think in Toronto, the lassos have been doing an amazing job at grounding people in this particular moment of a pandemic, but also in what it means to be creative souls. When I look back, and I would always go between, again, organizationally and artistically, because I function in both of those spaces. When the advent of like working online came into being, I mean, Charles and I and Victoria were a small organization. And over the 12 years of CPAMO, we don't have an office. Everything for us happens in a Zoom, not Zoom, but when we could meet, we'd meet once a week or twice a week, twice a month in a cafe and get the work done. There's no investment in a physical space, because that bricks and mortar takes money, and that's actually taxpayers' money, but we're very adamant about that. So I want to just also, not because I'm program manager, just say that we've been working in a digital space for a very, very long time. This is how we achieve all of the things that we've been doing. So for this example, I'm curious about, are there case studies coming from the arts ecology that we should be documenting and putting forward as a really, really innovative way of rethinking what innovation is looking like, what creativity is looking like? Because I think these are there. And the ways in which I engage creatively is not based on a funding model or system. It's based on research and a cultural nuance that exists from the ways in which I've been working. And that's with my company, Cashier Dance. So I do believe that there are also these case studies out there that I'm curious about amplifying into the space as we have this conversation as well.
Thanks, Kevin. You've given me the perfect segue, because I wanted to touch on this concept of innovation, because in my opening context setting, I'm also inviting a kind of problematizing of innovation. And I'm doing that in part because it is right now a hot topic. Innovation was, talked about as a key priority for the Canada Council in its new strategic plan. We also heard at the top of today from the mayor's office a leaning toward innovation. And so, the way that I'm thinking about this is that is innovation connected to this Western concept of progress, or do we need to, find new metaphors or new ways of thinking about innovation in order for it to be aligned with these values that you've all been talking about, values of deep listening, of health, of circular leadership, of all these, of meeting people where they are, of looking at a much wider expression of a human life as part of an artistic expression. And so when we think about innovation, the Canada Council in particular was sort of trying to decouple innovation in the form of like artistic process for the sake of art making, and innovation, I think, more in this context of the system of cultural production that we are all existing inside in the Canadian context. And so they're, trying to say this is not innovation. What is meant by innovation is not what artists do when they make art. Innovation is meant to be about everything else around it. And so I find that personally a very challenging idea. And because, Renata, you talked about process over product. And so when we think about the artist's process, and, is it just for the purpose of art making? Or is the artist's process, in fact, one of the ways that we can start to consider innovation with a lens that holds a different set of values, that is not just about growth and progress and change for the sake of change, but it's rooted in something. It's rooted in kind of a new metaphor. So I want to open that, and actually I really do want to invite some input from the audience here, because this question of innovation, it's going to drive where resources go, and we will all be affected by that. And so I would welcome any further input as well, but I'd like to invite the panel to speak to this. So let's continue going around the circle.
It's really interesting that we feel like, again, came full circle, because some of us on this conversation remember when Trillium was all about innovation, and we had to take whatever methodologies and ideologies and everything that we found that work within our sectors and modify them to fit into these square little round pegs in square holes. It was really trying to define, like, it depended on who you ask how they defined innovation. So is it something new? Is it modification? Is it restructuring and everything? So it's kind of like saying safe space. Everybody's got their own definition of what a safe space is. There's no one size fits all. So it's kind of really feeling like, okay, we're pushing that dialogue. Okay, we want to make things innovative. So I totally, when we were talking about the conscious uncoupling of innovation, it's one of those things where trying to move that dial forward while ensuring that we pay respect and honor everything that's come behind us too. So it's really been that kind of yin and yang kind of thing happening. Within the Indigenous performing arts sector, it's been really, again, having to reach back into our traditions and everything to try and modernize them in order to create a new language. So this is when a lot of focus on language of the body, language of dialogue, language of how we interpret our ways of doing. And one thing that's been really interesting is saying, okay, you know what, innovation is going to be putting the onus on the person who's absorbing the information. So this is why you see a real resurgence of speaking in our language. And if you don't understand, that's okay. we're going to have that conversation. We're going to put these ways of learning forward to new audiences and everything, and that's innovative. So we're opening that discussion, and some might say that's strictly allyship, but it's not. It's creating a new form of dialogue and everything. It's kind of, I lovingly say it's kind of like how our Indigenous people felt when settlers arrived and spoke a different language and we had to learn. Now it's your turn, kind of thing. So it's a Nyawagoa kind of thing. It's been kind of that way. So again, it depends. It's been a really tricky one, and it's okay. I'll say it's kind of unfortunate that there's so much, because so many people feel innovation is embracing digital technologies. It's all in modern and unique forms like that. But innovation, again, can be something depending on the artist and how they move within their environment, could be new and innovative. And how do we celebrate those kind of those new ways of thinking and ensure that that voice is heard at these conversations with equal validity as you would with the technology and VR discussions and what is it? Having to create my avatar to attend a conference now. So, okay, because that's innovative. And I was like, well, no, there's really no need for that. So again, I think that's kind of addressing what you were putting out there. But again, if there's any questions, put them in the chat.
Thank you. And there is a little bit of action in the chat. Thank you, everyone. I love this first comment. Innovation should be in know, as in KNOW-vation, right? So transforming knowledge, that's how I'm interpreting that, transforming knowledge. And also this point about, oh, thanks, Peter. Yeah. And also this point about language. Yes, language. You know, I think there's so much wisdom embedded, cultural wisdom embedded in language of Indigenous peoples. And I think it's just, I mean, imagine what's there. And I feel actually a very strong sense of gratitude towards all the Indigenous peoples that are investing in learning the lost languages that the Colonial Project tried to take away. And I think this is some of the most important work that is happening right now, because these languages have emerged from a culture that understands the relationship to land. And to me, that has a connection to innovation, because, you know, innovation works in this relational space, or can work in this relational space. And what I'm hearing you say, Cynthia, is that we need to think about these relationships differently. That if innovation is simply serving an agenda, you know, a capitalist agenda, or even a production-based agenda, then it's not really centered in a sense of relationality at all. And it's sort of missing the point, you know. There's a couple other points I'm just going to read out here. The merit of innovation tends to be defined by ability of the concepts to make profit, yes, to save money on current systems, but artists tend to define the merit of innovation by the scope of cultural and societal learning that is discovered. Beautiful. So there's definitely nuance to the definition of innovation, because something can be innovative and not profitable. Yes. Another comment, innovation is often frankly exhausting. Yeah, I think we are all still in such a place of transition that we are innovating every day. Maybe I'm being a whiner, but tired of being asked to be innovative. Yeah, agreed, Megan, thank you. And I think this is bringing up the thing that I get excited about, which is redefining these concepts, right? So decoupling these concepts from their Euro-Western definitions and from their, you know, capitalist definitions, and saying, okay, if we want to, as an artist community, think and work in a context of innovation, well, let's first decide what that means to us, and then work toward, you know, serving those collective aims. Thank you for those out there sending in thoughts. Renata, can I turn to you for some reflection?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Shannon and Cynthia, such intelligent perspectives. So much of innovation can be about change of mindset and valuing of the human relationship. So we have an expression at Propeller Dance where we will say, take the time it takes when we're in process or anything actually, from governance to administration to creation. Take the time it takes. And I think that really goes against that capitalist Eurocentric worldview that worth is connected to economic output. And we encounter that a lot with ableism as well. During our Emerging Choreographers with Disability program now, we have a number of artists with various abilities, and we're finding new ways to support them in their process, so that they're taking their own creative leadership in creating new work. And finding new ways of documenting what they're doing. And we do use a lot of technology, and this digital format has been pretty useful to record everything. So we're not always relying on only auditory processing, but visual or other forms of processing information. And, you know, we can think about innovation of really like expanding our human potential too, and thinking about various different sensory approaches to things too. So some of the work that David Bobier is doing in Vibro Tactile Arts, and we're doing some work with him, is really fascinating. You know, the Euro traditional black box in a way is a form of sensory deprivation. And that can be so beautiful, right? Like we can crave that, and I love it and I miss it. On the other hand, some people might need a lot more sensory input. And so that's kind of interesting and innovative, and just finding new ways of expressing our different ways of being human. Your point earlier too about climate change and climate action and the environment, and that being innovative as well. I think we all in the arts community need to think about what's our relationship and impact. There's an artist, a colleague in the UK, Adam Benjamin, who's created a project called the Dancer's Forest, where they're purchasing land and stewarding the land for keeping it natural and also keeping it for dance specifically. So there's some interesting work happening around that. I don't think innovation necessarily means technology, but that has a place. Because we focus so much on digital these days, my colleague Shara Weaver has started a national digital disability and dance research project where we're working with organizations and artists with disability across the country to really break down accessibility within the digital format, so that we're looking at what ways of working digitally are truly accessible and truly possible for people to participate. Because, you know, a lot of people live in isolation on a regular day-to-day for a variety of reasons. So this way of connecting can actually be really useful. But we want to be able to do that in a way that is helpful and not harmful. And then just finally, you know, that sense of thinking about relationship, being innovative, and how we treat each other and how we treat our planet. I think that there's innovation around how we work together. We have a partnership with the Great Canadian Theatre Company in Ottawa, and Eric Coates and Hugh Nielsen decided that they were really, I paraphrase and simplify their words here, probably getting them wrong, but they were less interested in pursuing digital work, and they really wanted their theater to be a space for live art. So Propeller Dance is going to do a lot of digital programming next year, and we're able to partner with them to sort of fill that gap together. So to me, that feels in a way innovative, and I know that is happening across the country, and so many of us are doing that, that new way of working together. So I think you're right, and that we can reframe that word innovation and really reclaim it, and each of us for ourselves or collectively, whatever makes sense, think about how do we define it, because otherwise it'll get defined by others, those in power. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Renata. And yes, I agree. And I think this is why in this moment, when those kinds of concepts and terms come out of funders, this is where the engagement and the advocacy and the conversations in the field are so important, because we may not be understanding that notion in a similar way or in the way that it was intended. And if we are, once again, being invited to innovate for the sake of making more efficient our processes of production, like, count me out. I think that we need to be moving in a different direction than that. And I think it's actually a very beautiful thought. And I'm seeing this just in the chat. Denise Fujiwara says, everything old is new again, everything new is soon old, it's all relative. And I think this points to the cycles, right? Like, we're so linear, and we're thinking about like trying to be faster, bigger, better, stronger. And I love what you said, Renata, how it just takes the time it takes. And for me, actually, this has been personally a huge lesson in the pandemic. Like, the pace of my life before shutdown was completely unsustainable. And I'm seeing everybody nod. Yeah, I feel like if you work in the arts, your life is almost always completely unsustainable. But yeah, and so what does that mean to embody taking the time it takes? So this is something I'm working on. Kevin,
Good point,
talk
Shannon.
to us about innovation.
And
Thank you.
What are we going to do about that collectively? Because that's really important. Okay, moving on.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think the wellness is important. We could stay there. I think the wellness and acknowledging that we've been overworking is part of the innovation. This is where I want to start. When I started speaking my Jamaican accent, say, I don't play, take off this clothes and start to cuss and carry on. The very act of me being here right now as a Black person is centuries of innovation. I'm offering that as a way to think about how language and concepts are further problematizing how artists are relating to those things. Innovation has, and I encourage anybody out there who's an artist or working organizations, when you say those words innovation, to really put things behind them, the same way you do behind artistic excellence and blah, 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 blah. And as it's mentioned by some of the speakers before, is that it's self-defined. That's my biggest challenge with innovation. How does a company that doesn't have operating funding do innovative work? I have to define what that work, the innovation is in that work. And that is also not dependent on output. It has to be independent on input because I'm under-resourced. So for me, the challenge there is this dichotomy of then going, okay, what is a creative practice? What is a process? Because I have to understand what process it is I'm working in to be what I've now defined as innovative. And that's part of the challenge, I think, that when we have definitions through language coming from funding bodies and organizations, and we're applying into them and we're buying into them, we're buying into what has already been created as a larger productive structure that is further marginalizing IBPOC artists and arts organizations and the ways in which they creatively manifest the work that they feel is creation. So, I don't want to get too academic and everything, but I think there's something really interesting in what I think Peter had posed, and also what Denise had posed around it being relative. Because if I understand that innovation is relative, I have to say, what is it relative to in terms of my work and what I want to create? But also this the innovation versus the innovation. I'm all about the knowledge. I think if we understand more, then we actually are providing more impact for people we're engaging with, but also for a sector. The challenge is we go through processes of receiving funding without understanding the implications of those fundings that we receive for not just the organizations we work with, but our creativity and also for the sector. So, the language of those words and those things are indeed problematic. But I do believe there's a potential in this moment, like other moments before and leading to the future, to begin to redefine what that language means and how we are engaging with it. Right? Because I'm
Yeah.
gonna come back. I'm going. The nature of me is to be like, what? That's not innovation for me. No, I come from a practice where you need to be, dance looks a certain way. And I've been in juries where that becomes dancey dance. And I go, well, wait, hold on a second here. What is dance? Because if I look in the dictionary, it said dance is this. So, being clear also about how that language then further implicates the work that some artists and organizations are doing in a negative way, as does innovation does, as does working digitally. Maybe some people don't want to work digitally. And it is quite okay. But maybe they want to invest in a good website, or all their dancers having internet access to come on for online classes. Where does that exist in a larger understanding in our arts ecology? I'm excited, clearly.
I love it. And, I am equally excited around this question of knowledge production. It's a question that I've been holding for myself, which is, how do we come to know what we know? And I've been in a pretty deep investigation of this question for, even before the pandemic began. And it's in part because I think this is one of the really fundamental concepts that we need to challenge in the Western worldview in order to lay the foundation for a pluralistic society. Because if there is only one way of knowing, then it has the effect of standardizing the human beings that live inside that system, which is deeply, deeply harmful to the vast majority of us. And I think that, this notion of how we come to know, as an embodiment practitioner, I understand knowledge not being centered in the rational mind. In fact, the body feeds a lot of wisdom into that rational, logical mind. And, the ways of knowing, I think, unfortunately, in the Western worldview, creates this notion of objective truth. And this is the thing I think we need to most essentially uncouple ourselves from, because objective truth is an absolute. And in fact, it's so in conflict with this idea of meaning making, which lives in the relational, in the experiential, in the subjective. So when we think about the funding systems that enable art making to occur, that support, like you said, Kevin, the inputs that enable innovation, defined on our own terms, to occur, well, we need to understand that there are many, many ways of working. There are many ways of knowing, and meaning making is not absolute. That, what is a masterful work of art according to one person may have very little meaning for another, because there is no standard human experience by which we relate to that artistic experience with, right? And so this is the dilemma. This is the dilemma of funding assessment. It's the dilemma of creating cultural policy, standards of artistic excellence, measurement of public value. Like this is at issue right now in a huge way. And I would love to hear some reflections, and from all of you out there too. So how do we change this? How do we uncouple ourselves from this, Western objective model of truth and knowledge in order to lay a better foundation for how these policies and funding decisions are made in our system? Can I turn to our panelists? But I really do want to hear from the from the room, as it were, because we're going to go into some breakout soon to talk more. But please feel free, chime in, and Cynthia, I'll come around to you again.
Well, that it's a really complex, multi-layered question. And it's that whole thing of you don't know what you don't know. So that's the starting point. And to try and grapple, it brings in so many different layers. Like, okay, are you competing with the traditional knowledge and the I guess the frameworks that we've established and that we've built our teachings from and stuff like that? Or how do we expand that too? There's also the time parameters and everything, like it's an open-ended question because there are no parameters. So it's really, Sorry, I'm having a hard time with that one. I'm going to actually throw it to my other, if I can circle back maybe. How's that? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Renata, would you like to grapple with this one a little bit?
Kevin, I think you might have more to say. I can see it. I will come back to it, but if you have something.
Oh.
Go, Kevin.
Well, I do believe that it should come from the persons, from the creators, from creating systems. So for example, when the pandemic happened, there was just tons of demands in terms of like, are we going to do class online? Are we going to and it was just like, no, right now, what I need as an artistic director is to slow down, think about what it means, because what I did not want to do was replicate the things that we were doing before. What I did not want to do was go, okay, we have to now do this because everybody else is doing this. How do we do it? And I was been, in a way that was supporting the artists I work with. And in what ways we can begin to think of a system moving forward that is in a iterative but a responsive space. And when I say responsive, I'm talking about being responsive to the moment in time, that the technology might not work, that dancers are not in a studio, they can't lift their leg in their living room. Some people live in a studio apartment. How are we creating, what are the artistic contents of the things that we can create in this moment in time that is also about the well-being for the artists, that are also beyond the expectations that we know we also, and I put that on my dancers as well, because I run an organization as AD, put on the dancers. One of the biggest things for me is understanding even this thing around impact and the art of like what we could do moving forward is taking away time, as Cynthia mentioned. But we still have to report to a council for funding that we got to do this production that I'm just like, that ain't gonna happen anytime soon. Canada Council, you can take back the money that has not been spent. You can leave it with the company to support the dancers to do something. But is it still tied to the idea of an old normative around, it's gonna be a production, and it's gonna be in a space. And it's like, can I just give them money? Can I just be like, here you go, you signed a contract, this was the intent, it may not happen? And can I be also in my leadership, just be as open as that? When I'm asked, do you have an idea? And I go, I don't actually have any idea, because every idea I've had, we are still in a pandemic. So I think it is a responsive state that it's encouraging us and the ecology to be in, that is about the moments, that the tangible moments right now in this particular time and space.
Renata, I want to turn it back to you, because I think that this point about well-being perhaps intersects with some of what you've really been thinking deeply about.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin is such a wonderful speaker. It's amazing. I think what Kevin said was so true, in that you have to be responsive to where you are and who you're working with and the situation. And I just want to share two things. Is it's taken us, I think, almost the entire year of working digitally and giving all kinds of training and technological support, becoming tech support instead of a choreographer, to parents, to support workers, to dancers, to really figure out and support one of our dancers, Jessie Huggett, who's working on a piece about identity. And she's chosen to create that piece on Zoom, and have it be a Zoom work. And she doesn't want it to go back into the studio and be a live work. She's really, but I would say it's really that process has taken us the entire year to get there. And a lot of that, another dancer has not been well at all through this pandemic. And we've been dropping off care packages and making phone calls and trying to get the support in place, because we want the dancer to return to his work, you know, when this is over. But that blurring of lines between, you know, we are very fortunate to be in receipt of operating money. So we're in a position to have that luxury of taking that time. Yeah, I think that sense of martyrdom in our community has been going on a little too long. and how do we ensure that our industry is supported properly, really, in all the ways that it needs to be? It's not too much to ask. Without artists and culture, we are innovation. We are a responsive window into this nation called Canada, you know. So I think we can have a lot of pride in that space. And then just finally, one of our methods for working at Propeller Dance, our methodology is really looking at common denominators. So whenever we have our opening circle and we meet everybody and we have our way of everybody introducing themselves, we always look for that common denominator among the group and work from that out and out. So I'm sure many of us might have a similar practice. And so that's really fun. What could we do together to explore that in different ways as well? So looking for those common denominators comes back to the breath, right? The life force and the breath. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks. And I saw that somebody had a hand up. So.
Okay, I'm going to pass over to you, Cynthia, for any further comments on this one, and then we'll make a transition after that into some breakouts. But I have a few things to say before we get there. So Cynthia, over to you.
Sure. If I can riff off what Renata was saying, one thing that I just wanted to bring up, reciprocity. That's the one key element that gets us the ability to, I guess, have equal opportunities and equal points of discussion and everything, when we know that when we put in, we can also get back too. So it's been really interesting to have these conversations and to share our knowledge and everything on equal playing fields, and to have using that to build the sector, rebuild the sector, build a new sector, however we want to envision it. So yeah, that's the only thing I just wanted to point in there, because it's, again, I'm on this panel of star people. So I think the rest has been spoken to. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. You know, it's not a hierarchy. We're not stars. We're all stars. Yes, Kevin.
I was also going to say that, you know, I mentioned in the chat this idea of, like, if you're from an operating organization or you're curious about supporting artists, that maybe you apply. And I'm not talking about applying to Canada Council for the Digital now, and I'm talking about maybe apply to invest in things that can support the development for artists. With my company, we did that. And although it was, like, as I mentioned, a very bureaucratically oppressive application process, we were successful. And that was actually digital video equipment to support the IBPOC community through, you know, because it's going to be a part of our existence moving forward. So, you know, what are some ways we can think about it, as you mentioned, in the future? And I forgot to talk about it because I was on a rant. And a huge long comment was thinking about the ways in which our organizations can support a community of practice, or communities of practice that we may be able to collaborate on and provide that support.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think it's so needed because, you know, if we are going to sort of uncouple ourselves from a kind of accountability to a system, then can we create accountability to each other and the people we work with, the people we're serving, the communities we're situated in, the land that we're situated on? Like, how do we think about those relationships as being central, as being, you know, where those values are expressed? And And, you know, the funder will always remain a kind of important part of the ecosystem, so long as we're sort of existing in a system of cultural production. But I think from all that's been said, I really just hear a lot of beautiful thinking around care, around reciprocity, around interrelationship, around language and defining terms for ourselves, around yeah, like creating a kind of beautiful resistance to some of the old ways, and trying to do that together in community.